our first presenter, Rich Haridy. Rich is presenting to us tonight. Let me tell you about Rich first. You would have seen Rich interviewing Douglas Rushkoff at the EGA Garden States event. That was my favourite personal talk and an amazing interview, and it was really a pleasure to watch both of them in conversation. Rich has written for a number of online and print publications over the last decade, while also acting as a film critic for several radio broadcasters and podcasts. His interests focus on psychedelic science, new media, and science oddities. Rich completed his master's degree in the arts at the University of Melbourne back in 2013 and was chair of the Australian Film Critics Association for 2 years between 2013 and 2015 before joining science and technology news outlet New Atlas in 2016. Since joining the New Atlas team, Rich's interests have considerably broadened to examine the era-defining effects of new technology on culture and life in the 21st century. Thank you, Rich.
Hello. My name is Rich Haridy, and I'm an independent journalist who's been closely following the recent Australian TGA rescheduling of psilocybin and MDMA. So we're about 9 weeks away from scheduling D-Day, so to speak, when the gates open and psilocybin becomes a prescribable drug. So I think now is a good moment to take a look at what we do know and what we don't know about how psychedelic medicine is going to work here in Australia from the 1st of July. At the risk of starting with the obvious, I think it's important to stress how narrow this TGA authorization is. So magic mushrooms are not now legal in Australia, and your GP is not going to be casually offering psilocybin as part of a random health checkup. Psilocybin has only been approved by the TGA for treatment-resistant depression, so it cannot be offered as a first-line treatment. It needs to be offered after several other treatment modalities have been tried and shown to have failed. Unlike other parts of the world that are moving towards legalized psychedelic medicine, Australia has forged a unique path by moving these drugs through a very specific mechanism we have here, known as the Authorised Prescriber Scheme. This scheme is not new. In fact, it's been widely used for several years for medicinal cannabis. So in the context of psilocybin for depression, to become an authorised prescriber, you need to first be a registered psychiatrist. You then need to apply for approval through a Human Research Ethics Committee. So there are dozens of HRECs around Australia. These are panels composed of experts and lay people who review clinical research to make sure it's ethically acceptable. HRECs are often attached to universities or hospitals, but there are also HRECs attached to charities and commercial clinical research organisations. So once you get your HREC approval, the authorised prescriber process is pretty straightforward. You fill an online form with the TGA, it's reviewed and then ticked off. Once you are an authorised prescriber, you can administer psilocybin as often as you need without having to file individual approvals for each individual prescription. All you need to do is send 6 monthly reports to your HREC, listing the volume of patients you've treated and noting whether you've encountered any adverse safety effects with the treatment. So if you're like me, you probably have plenty of questions right now about how these drugs are going to be administered. And here's where things get a bit blurry. The TGA has made it very clear that its only regulatory role in this process is in overseeing access to the drugs. In the context of this, the TGA explicitly states it plays no role in the development of clinical protocols or how clinical practice is undertaken. In fact, during a webinar in early March, the now former head of the TGA, John Skerritt, repeatedly avoided all questions over clinical practice, stressing that there will be no strictly defined protocols for psilocybin treatment in Australia. So what this all means is that we have no regulatory requirements governing how psilocybin is administered here. So what is the treatment protocol for psilocybin? How many therapy sessions need to accompany a dose? Who's conducting these preparatory and integration therapy sessions, and who's present with a patient while they're taking the actual drug? All of these questions are currently up in the air. And the TGA is punting oversight of these clinical protocols to the individual HREC that approves each authorized prescriber application. Skerritt has very clearly stated that these are all issues for HREX and not the TGA. So herein lies what I see as the biggest looming problem for psychedelic medicine in Australia, because you see, not all HREX are the same. Some are quite stringent and only pass ethics approvals to robust applications, while others are a little looser, offering approvals through web-based application forms with tidy little application fees. The TGA has pointed to a variety of clinical frameworks that it suggests, and I quote, you could expect HREX to consider. For example, a minimum standard of training for therapists involved in these treatments is suggested to be that of a clinical psychologist. However, this is not a regulatory requirement. So could an HREC approve a protocol involving post-drug sessions delivered by a basic therapist or counsellor? Maybe. A study published late last year is often pointed to by the TGA as the most convincing clinical study that it's seen for psilocybin therapy. And this was a Compass Pathways phase 2B trial that looked at a single dose of psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. And well, from my perspective, the study was far from a convincing demonstration of the effectiveness of psilocybin for depression. It does offer a kind of clinical protocol that the TGA seems likely to expect as the minimum standard. That study focused on a single 25 milligram dose of psilocybin, accompanied by 2 to 3 preparatory sessions and 2 post-dose integration sessions. So while the study did wean all its participants off any antidepressant drugs over several weeks leading up to the active psilocybin session, if we were to crunch the whole protocol down, it could be condensed into as little as about 2 weeks, with a couple of pre and a couple of post-therapy sessions, bookending a day-long drug session. The Compass trial did have 2 therapists present with patients during all drug sessions. And this is something that MAPS also mandates for its MDMA for PTSD protocols, something that for safety reasons I would probably argue is very important. However, it's unclear whether this will be necessary for psychedelic sessions here in Australia. It's also unclear who will need to be present for those dose-day sessions. If the authorised prescriber psychiatrist needs to be present for the whole day-long 6 to 8 hour dose, then you can be sure psychedelic therapy in Australia will be very expensive and very difficult to access. But on the other hand, if an authorised prescriber only needs to be present for the moment of dosing, then who will be accompanying patients on these experiences and what types of training will those people need? There are psychedelic therapist trainings programs rolling out in Australia. Some are limited to those with clinical psychology training, while others have very broad eligibility requirements, offering training to everyone from counsellors to pharmacists to alternative medicine practitioners. It does need to be stressed that none of these training programs are accredited by the TGA as necessary to be involved in psychedelic therapy. The only legal regulatory hurdle that is being put up is that a psychiatrist needs to become an authorised prescriber to prescribe the psilocybin as a drug. So what does all this ultimately mean? Well, it means that there's likely to be very little consistency in authorised prescriber approvals. So different HRECs are likely to approve different clinical protocols. And this part of the process really concerns me, because how is a patient able to evaluate the authorised prescriber psychiatrist they may have been referred to? The TGA has very strict rules around what information can be advertised around medicines that are under the authorised prescriber scheme. So it will be nearly impossible for a patient to easily understand what the specific protocols are for any given psychedelic therapist they encounter. There are a couple of other important issues that I think are really worth keeping an eye on as these therapies begin to roll out in Australia. And one is, of course, I think the biggest elephant in the room for psychedelic medicine, and that is the cost. These treatments will be expensive. And because the authorised prescriber scheme here is focused on medicines yet to receive formal TGA approval, it means these treatments will not be accessible through Medicare or PBS subsidies. So a single dose psilocybin treatment with the briefest pre and post therapy is still likely to cost at least $5,000. An MDMA for PTSD, which is generally a longer 12-week 2 to 3 dose protocol, is likely to cost between $15,000 and $20,000. So who can afford these medicines and who will initially be accessing them? These are big questions. The other kind of massive issue here is the TGA's refusal or inability to mandate any kind of patient registry to monitor treatment efficacy. So there's no requirement for authorized prescribers to report whether these treatments are working or how often a patient is requiring treatment. The only mandate is that they report any adverse effects. So this will make it nearly impossible to know whether patients are actually getting positive results from these medicines as they get used more and more out in the real world. There will be no centralized data gathering of treatment efficacy, which is kind of crazy. And here we are, a couple of months away from legal psychedelic medicine in Australia. And I think some other speakers tonight will talk about how there are expert bodies being set up to try and offer guidance and oversight to practitioners in Australia. And I applaud those clinicians for doing that work. It's important work. But we'll see what happens in the real world, because any boards and bodies that are set up will not at all be governed by regulatory requirements, at least through the TGA. So authorized prescriber applications will start coming through around the 1st of July. And I'm sure there are some laissez-faire HRECs out there that are ready to feed approvals to applications with protocols that are less than robust, meaning the back end of 2023 is certainly going to be interesting. Thanks for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the webcast tonight.